Hello, everybody, and welcome to ACM SIGGRAPH Frontiers Interactions. My name is Tomasz Bednarz. I'm the chair of Frontiers program at SIGGRAPH 2021. And I wanted to basically introduce the program a bit. So the Frontiers program, in just 2 sentences, explores emerging topics and complex new problems. It as well explores latest in graphics, robotics, AI, arts, visualization, responsible technology, and adjacent technologies. Adam, can we go to the next one, please? And before we start, I wanted to emphasize the fact about ACM SIGGRAPH policy against harassment. So this is live stream and it's moderated by ACM SIGGRAPH. We ask that all comments stay respectful of others and respect ACM's policy against harassment. That means exercise consideration and respect in your speech and actions, refrain from demeaning, discriminatory, and harassing behavior and speech, and be mindful of your fellow participants. Thank you. So now it is my great pleasure to introduce our Frontiers Interaction speaker. Our distinguished speaker is John Whittle. So John is the director of CSIRO's Data 61, the digital and data science arm of Australia National Science Agency. Prior to joining Data 61, John was Dean of the Faculty of Information Technology at Monash University. He was named CEO's Magazine 2019 Education's Executive of the Year. John is also a former technical area lead at NASA, where he worked on software for NASA space missions. John is passionate about the role of digital technologies can play in society. He has world-leading reputation on how to adopt software development methods to fully take into account human values and ethics, so that we build software for a society we want rather than we get by accident. So please join me welcoming John. John, over to you. Thank you for being part of this.
Thank you, Thomas. I'll just wait for my slides to come up. There we go. Great, so thank you very much for inviting me. Really looking forward to giving this talk. It's going to be a bit of a whirlwind tour through some work that I've been doing with my team at Monash University for the last 3 or 4 years now. And what I'm hoping to convince you in this talk is that we're developing software the wrong way. And we're not considering what I call human values, which are the kind of broader aspects of what makes us human when we develop software. And we really ought to be doing that because we're now in a world where software is making decisions for us in society and is actually shaping what future society is going to look like. And so if we don't think about those human values and don't embed those human values in the actual lines of code that we create, we're going to create problems for ourselves. So just a little bit of history, first of all. So some of you might recognize this image. This is actually a photograph from the so-called Garmisch conference, which is a very famous conference that took place a little over 50 years ago. And it's commonly kind of acknowledged to be the birthplace of the discipline of software engineering. It was the start of work looking at coming up with, systematic methods, tools, and techniques for engineering software. And there's been a huge amount of progress since then. We've come up with various kind of standard designs, standard techniques, standard notations, standard tools, and so forth that help us develop software at scale with the functionality that we expect at a cost that we can afford, that is, for the most part, safe, secure, and even more recently respects data privacy. So, of course, not all problems have been solved, but I think 5 decades of pretty good progress on defining what this discipline of software engineering is. But I am going to argue today that there's actually quite a lot of stuff that's missing in the way that we currently think about and develop software. And in particular, once you get beyond security, privacy, safety, functionality, and cost, you can ask about things like, well, what about inclusion and diversity? Is this kind of built into the software that we create? Well, partially. There's been a lot of work on accessibility standards, for example. But I think it's fairly easy to argue that we don't really develop software primarily taking into account things like inclusion and diversity. But what about other things? What about things like transparency? So we all want organizations and governments and so forth to be transparent, but is the software that they use supporting that transparency? Is that actually built into the software that we create? Or what about things like integrity? We want companies that have integrity. We want individuals in public office to have integrity. Again, is the software that is supporting them building that integrity in? Or even things like compassion. Do we build software that promotes compassion? Now, you might think that's an odd thing to say, but let's imagine a scenario where you're putting software into a hospital, and maybe that software is going to interact directly with patients. You probably want to develop that software thinking first and foremost about compassion, so that you're compassionate towards your patients. Or what I think about things even like self-respect. I would argue that, we want to build software that promotes self-respect, or even, kind of changes power relationships and kind of breaks down unfair power relationships. And even things like, respecting tradition in different cultures, or even respecting kind of family values. So what I'm arguing today is that all of those things that I just listed on the previous slide are examples of human values. They're things that we value, that we think are important as human beings. And yet, if you look at the kind of current state of the software engineering discipline, we've focused on a very small subset of values over the last 5 decades: functionality, cost, safety, privacy, and so forth. And there's actually been very little attention, some, but very little attention on these broader human values like inclusion, diversity, responsibility, transparency, and well-being. And I'm going to argue today that it's time for a fundamental shift in that figure. But before we do that, let's ask a more fundamental question. Does this all matter? Do we need to actually think about these broader human values when we're developing software? Well, I think it's pretty topical right now. This isn't a talk about AI, but you all will have heard and read about AI ethics now. Most governments across the world have now developed some kind of AI ethics framework. And these have arisen because of well-documented examples of bias in machine learning systems and AI systems that are, well known to be discriminatory or unfair. And probably one of the best known examples of this is the Compass system in the United States, which was an AI system that was used to help parole boards make decisions about which criminals were likely to reoffend and therefore should not be given parole. And a famous study of that showed that this system was twice as likely to flag black defendants as reoffenders as white defenders. And it was essentially a racially discriminatory AI system. But it's not the only example of AI systems that have shown to be biased. Another one that I always quote is the case of Molly Russell, who was a British teenager who tragically committed suicide in 2017. She was into self-harm, and she went onto Instagram to look at images of self-harm. And unfortunately, because of the way that the recommender algorithms work on Instagram, she was then served up with more and more images of self-harm on her feed. And her father famously argued that Instagram was responsible for her death. So we've got a real problem with AI ethics. And as I'll say later, ethics is very related to what I call human values. But it's not just AI. So all the focus has actually been on AI. But I want to just broaden your mind a little bit today. It's actually any software system that we develop that could have these biases or these lack of consideration of human values built in. And here's a simple example. So in 2017, Hurricane Irma came through Florida. Now, what happened then was that the government initiated a mandatory evacuation order for people to leave Florida. Now, in normal times, the cost of an airline ticket to get from Miami to Phoenix is about $500. During Hurricane Irma, the cost of a ticket from Miami to Phoenix was about $3,000. And you can imagine why. There was a mandatory evacuation order. Everybody went online to try and book an airline ticket. And because the airline pricing systems work on supply and demand algorithms, the price shot up. And the New York Times described this at the time as a real problem because, ethical valves were not built into the design of those airline pricing systems. And so people that were in the midst of a natural disaster were actually disadvantaged unfairly. This is not an AI system. It's a fairly straightforward supply and demand dynamic pricing system, certainly not terribly smart. And so it just illustrates that these kinds of issues can happen even in systems that are not what we consider as AI and machine learning nowadays. But it's even worse than that. You can even imagine a very mundane system like a HR recruitment system. Anybody who's ever been on an interview panel knows that you're trained nowadays on things like unconscious bias and trying to take into account, if anyone's had any parental leave periods. But if you look at the interface design of these types of HR recruitment systems, it's very difficult to get information about whether anyone's actually taken time out to take care of children. It's not flagged. It's not very prominent. You kind of have to dig down into the CV. And if you're looking at 200, 300 CVs, you can easily miss that. And what I'm arguing today, that if we'd actually considered that value of diversity and actually built that in as a first-class artifact into the way we designed that system, then that kind of information about parental leave and time out for good reason could have been made much more prominent, and that could actually lead to more diverse workforces. And so what I'm essentially saying here is that any design decision that we take at any level of software development, whether it's during requirements or very, very detailed coding, is not values agnostic. Whatever design decision we take, whether it's explicit or implicit, we're going to affect the values that that system has, and therefore, when that system is deployed, the values that are kind of imparted to our society. Now, this is not a new thing. Actually, researchers in kind of human-computer interaction, community and information systems have known this for a long time. But it's generally true that in software development discipline, this is not a well-known fact. And in fact, people would argue against it. But this is my point today, I guess, is that although there's been some work in HCI and areas like that and this kind of thing, the software discipline really hasn't looked at this, and we don't have any as yet systematic end-to-end software engineering process for making sure that we build human values in from the beginning. And just to touch upon some of that work that has been done, there's well-known work in values-sensitive design and values in design. As I said, that comes largely from the IS and HCI communities, hasn't got into the broad mainstream of software development or even software engineering research. And this work tends to focus on the kind of the front end, the requirements, high-level design of how you develop software, and pretty much ignores things like software testing, low-level detailed design, and so forth. We are seeing some changes now with some works in the software engineering community, but it's very, very early days. Now, the question that we ought to ask, though, because I've kind of made this claim that software development isn't considering human values, but is it true? And so my team, we actually did a study. We did a number of studies, in fact, in the software industry, going into software companies and studying how they deal with values, if they deal with values on a day-to-day basis. And we found a number of interesting things. So the first thing that we found is that software developers on the ground don't think that things like human values are their responsibility. They will say things like, oh, that's above my pay grade, that's for the CEO to worry about, that's for the managers to worry about. And I think that's a problem because, as I've said, design decisions at any level of the development process can affect the values that that system has. So even kind of software developers on the ground need to be thinking about this. The other thing that we found that out there in the industry, there's a wide spectrum of what I call values maturity. So you'll find some companies that actually take values pretty seriously. They have strong corporate values, for example, and they've got ways of making sure that those corporate values are respected across the organization. And then you'll have other companies, other software companies that really have never thought about this kind of issue at all, and just about everything in between. When we do find companies that actually think strongly about values, it tends to be the case that it's thought of as a cultural or organizational issue. That is, you define a set of corporate values. Maybe you have HR come in and do some training. Maybe if you're doing really well, you take that into account in your recruitment processes. But it never really encroaches upon the technical work. When you're using design patterns or taking particular design decisions as part of your software process, you don't think about values. So it's even in the values mature software organizations or organizations that are using software, values are only thought of at a very, very high level in management, not actually during software development. And when we do see values considered, it tends to be a very, very small set of the human values that are actually taken into account, things like accessibility, privacy, security, and so forth, not the broader range of human values that I've talked about. And that's in the industry, but actually it's true in research as well. So we did a study of the last 5 years of software engineering research, and we tried to assess, how much of that research considered these broader human values. We found that only 16% of research considered values at all. Of the values considered, it was mainly security and privacy. If you remove security and privacy, not that they're not important, but if you remove them, you'll find that the broader set of human values, really only 10% of the research considered those. So I think we have a problem. All right, so I've talked a lot about values. I've given you some hints of what values are, but let me just digress and give you a better definition, because you're probably wondering about that. So turns out there are different definitions of values out there in the literature. It's actually been a topic that's been studied, particularly in social psychology, for a long time. One of the most well-known and well-accepted frameworks for defining human values was developed by a researcher called Shalon Schwartz. And he essentially did studies in 82 different countries and did, kind of in-depth questionnaires and interviews with people to try and understand what we think of, what we mean when we use a term like human values. And he came up with a framework that said that there are kind of 10 universally accepted values, the black boxes here. And a couple of things to note about this. So first of all, universally accepted in the sense that we would all look at these and think, yes, they're a value. They're things that people can value. We don't necessarily all agree with the same set of values at any point in time. It's fine to have different values. And in fact, as an individual, we will have different values at different stages of our life. Values are inherently conflicting with each other often. The other point to notice about this is that values are not moral things. So you'll find some values on here that seem moral, like benevolence, but there are also other values on here that are almost amoral, like hedonism or power. So values are just things that we value as human beings. They're different from ethics, as I will talk about in a minute. But this gives you some kind of framework to actually start to talk about, what values are. And once we've got that, we can then actually talk about how we embed them in software. There are other ways of doing this. You can look at corporate values, for example. So there's this study by Maitland that showed that of the FTSE 100 companies, 85% of those had corporate values statement on their website. And that gives you another lens through which to look at values. So what do we do about it? So we've got a framework for values. We're not taking those values into account when we develop software. So how do we change things? And I think the key challenge here is that values are typically quite vague things, whereas in the software development world, we're used to dealing with software requirements. And these are typically not vague things. In fact, the whole history of software requirements has been about trying to specify them in a way that they are precise enough so that developers can understand them and they can actually implement them, and the customer and the developer are on the same page in terms of what they are. So that's the key challenge that we have. You can imagine if you're a software developer on the ground working day to day, and you've got two things in front of you. You've got a pretty well-defined traditional software requirement specification on the one hand, and then you've got a statement of the values that you want in that software on the other hand. One is quite concrete, one is very vague. Which one are you going to look at? You're going to look at the concrete one. It makes your job easier. And you're going to think, yeah, the nice vague values one is nice, but there's not a lot you can do with it. Now, quick digression. I put, the word ethics comes up here a lot. I just want to make the point that values and ethics are not the same thing. Ethics are things that have a kind of societally agreed moral norm to them. Values, as I said earlier, are not necessarily associated with morals or ethics. They could be. So you can think, if you like, that the things that we normally think about as ethics are a kind of subset of human values, but they're not the only things. So what have we done in our team to try and address this? So where we've got to, I guess, in this talk so far is that we've got a framework for defining what values is at some level, although it's still quite vague. Needs to be operationalized on the ground for software developers. And we've got evidence that software developers are not thinking enough about values, and in fact, that part of the reason is because they don't have the right techniques or software processes to do that. So we've spent a bit of time doing a few projects looking at how we can actually change the software industry so that software developers are given tools, techniques, processes to actually incorporate these values when they develop software and embed them as primary artifacts. We started with Agile Methods. So Agile Methods are probably the most popular form of software development process right now. They're very people-focused, so they lend themselves very nicely to this values work. And when we started working with companies, and we essentially went in and worked with them and co-designed with them, how can we get values into their Agile methods, we discovered something quite interesting. And that is to put values into software development. We don't need a revolution. When we first started this work, we thought we would need a revolution. We thought we would have to revolutionize the way that we develop software. It turns out that you don't need to do that. You can actually evolve existing software methods fairly easily. And that's a good thing, because if we came up with a revolutionary method, it would be very difficult to get the software industry to adopt that. Whereas if we evolve things more slowly and organically, there's much greater likelihood that the software industry is going to embrace those methods and we'll end up with better methods. So just to give you a snapshot of the kind of work that we've been doing. So if you look at Agile Methods, you can basically break down any Agile method into kind of 4 categories. So there's the artifacts, that's the artifacts that are produced as part of the software development process. There are the roles that people play in that software development process. There are what are called ceremonies. So these are, particular meetings or planning sessions and so forth that all Agile methods have. And then, of course, there's the culture around those software processes, and that features certainly very prominently in Agile methods. And what we've done, we've worked with companies to try and understand, given those 4 aspects of Agile methods, what would we have to change to really make these human values a primary consideration in the way that we develop software. And so if you look at artifacts, for example, the typical kind of artifacts you have in an Agile method, you might have a statement of intent, what's the software supposed to do? And you can augment that with what we're calling value statements, which is you've got a clear and explicit statement of what your values are as a company that you want to be embedded within that software, or what your customers' values are that you want to be embedded in that software. Other artifacts, there's a thing called user stories that are very commonly used in Agile methods, which are very, very simple ways of capturing requirements. And we've augmented those into something called value stories, so that when you specify your requirements, you don't just say what you want to build, you say why you want to build it. What value is it going to actually bring? What human value is it going to address? Similarly, with roles, we found that that there are typically roles like Scrum Master or Product Manager and so forth in Agile. We found the need for a couple of new roles. So you need a values champion. You need someone that's going to champion these human values throughout your development process and keep reminding everybody that these are important things. But you also need something that we call a values translator. And this is somebody that can really kind of bridge that vague world of the human values and the much more kind of concrete world and technical world of development. and can translate between the two. And that gets you over this vagueness gap, so that if you're looking, for example, at a very high level value like benevolence, that value is translated can say what that actually means in the context of that specific company, in that specific product. And then in terms of the ceremonies, we found that essentially you can take any agile ceremony that exists and you can put values into it, valuefy it if you like. So when you're doing planning and you're prioritizing what you're going to do in the next sprint, you can prioritize those that are going to satisfy your human values. When you're doing your retrospectives and you reflect on how the development went in the last sprint, you should have a part of that where you specifically discuss how you address those human values. And we've even got something called third pillar calls, which actually is a term that came from one of the companies that we worked with, where you build in to every agile process time set aside specifically for discussing human values amongst the team, checking in with each other, making sure that the design decisions that you're taking respect those human values, and if they don't, change those human values. And then, of course, you've got the cultural piece, which is not specific to agile values, but you need to make sure that there's things like psychological safety, which becomes very important here, because people need to feel that they're working in an open environment where they can raise issues, they can point out design decisions that don't respect human values, and they can say something about that and it will get addressed. And of course, you want to hire for what your values are. So that's kind of the end of the 20 minutes. That was a whistle-stop tour through some of the work that we've been doing and my argument about why we actually need to change the way that we're developing software. Really very happy to take any questions that people have, but if you want to know more about this, there is a website where you can go and see some of the work that we've been doing in our team at Monash University. And yeah, looking forward to hearing your questions and answering your questions. Thank you.
Amazing, awesome. Thank you so much, John. Just having a look at the comments now, and we've got a lot of activity there, lots of comments, lots of talking points. If anyone does have questions, please drop them in. So I'm going to be working through them now. But sort of to kick us off, I guess, Vivica on YouTube says that it's worth looking at the BBC Human Values Project. They're focused on metrics for broadcasting and online services to replace things like hits and time on page. And that kind of element of like time spent on a platform and stuff is really interesting, I think, in relation to this value-driven software approach. Is that something that sort of factors into your consideration or your team's consideration of human values?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm aware of that BBC work. I think the point here is, how do you measure values? And that comes up as a question a lot when you talk to developers about this, because, you know, or even more managers, because they want to measure things. You can do things like metrics, and we've also got other work that we've got going on in our group. So we've got a PhD student right now who's actually trying to, funnily enough, apply AI to measure human values. So it's a bit kind of meta, but essentially he's building a system where he's analyzing repositories in GitHub. And he's looking at the developer comments in there and looks at what they're talking about when they're checking in feature updates and so forth, and seeing if they're talking about the values. And then you can kind of get a dashboard that says, you know, these are the values that you've said are important, and this is what's actually going on in terms of the development process. So metrics are important. The only word of caution I would have about that is you just have to be careful, because values by their very nature are not easily kind of watered down into an easy set of metrics. So I think as long as you apply them in a sensible way and don't just think, okay, we've got 3 metrics, now we're done, and that satisfies our values, then that's a good way forward.
Excellent, awesome. And jumping off from that question as well, I'm talking about kind of trying to quantify the metrics in a sense and the values in a sense. Matt Adcock, I think over on Facebook, is asking, you mentioned that it's important for an organization to specify its own or its customers' values. But are there reasons you might formally specify a list of values at finer granularity? Could it even make sense for individual developers to have their own individual sets of values? Interesting question.
It is an interesting question. So the first thing you need to do if you're going to apply this or think about this is decide which values you're going to deal with. You can't focus on them all. I mean, you saw that Schwartz chart that I put up earlier. There's 10 high-level values there, but they're actually broken down into subsets of values, and about 53 in total. So if you try to address all 53 values at once, you'll struggle, I think. So you need to go through a process, first of all, when you kind of define which values are most important to you. Now, that can be done at different levels. You may say that it's societal values that you value the most, so the ethics. It may be your company's values, your corporate values. It may be your individual values, but I suppose you just need to be a little bit careful there, because you then need to make sure that in your company that the corporate values align with people's individual values, and if they don't, you probably got a problem. But yeah, the first step is to specify the list of values. There's actually fairly well understood ways of doing that from these fields like value-sensitive design. Typically, it's a case of kind of running workshops and getting representative sets of people in the room and so forth. And companies define their corporate values all the time. So that's pretty well understood part of the process. I think the bit that's less well understood is once you've got some kind of definition of your values, how do you then translate that down to the technical work?
Yes, absolutely. And it's interesting, we are getting a lot of questions around kind of the categorizing and sort of, I guess, the ontology almost of values, which is really cool and really interesting. And sort of to finish off on that point, Bashar, I apologize if I pronounce his name wrong, I'm horrible at pronunciations. Bashar Nuzib asks, great talk as always. Do you distinguish values from human values?
Yeah, great question. Look, to be honest, we went, when we started this work, we went a bit back and forth on what to call it. Values is a very overloaded term, it turns out. We started off with social values as the term that we were going to use, but then we found that had particular connotations in certain areas. So we settled on human values. I think I don't think it's so much a case of distinguishing values from human values, but we prefer the term human values because if you talk about values or value in certain parts of software community, they will immediately think that you're talking about business value. And there's even an area of software development called value-based software engineering. It gets confusing. That really is principally around economic value. How do you get the best economic value out of your software? So we're trying to make a distinction with that by calling it human values. So it's not just about that kind of. I mean, economic value is one value, but it's not the only one.
Yeah. So it becomes a bit of an etymological challenge, a bit like human-computer interaction rather than computer-human interaction.
Yeah,
you don't want to.
It does, and then you get into the whole values versus ethics thing, and and we even thought about, can we call it something different from values, but we could never really find a word that didn't have the same problem.
Fair enough. Human values has a good ring to it as well. So moving on from that a little bit, discussion about kind of things from I guess a corporate perspective or a structural perspective. Rowan Hughes on YouTube asks, I can imagine that there would be a good deal of pushback simply from a cost perspective. Is there any way how do you practically broach that, especially for smaller companies?
Yeah, it's a great question. Look, I think this comes back to what I was talking about earlier about kind of values maturity. So, I guess what we found working with companies is that it's not a kind of all or nothing kind of thing. It's not that, you have to necessarily invest a whole bunch of extra resources into kind of going all the way up the values maturity scale and doing everything. You can actually start small. And I would argue that even in smaller companies, startups and so forth, you can do things in the small with pretty low or even zero cost implication. It might be just in terms of how you hire. For example, if you look at a kind of classic startup right now, hiring developers, they typically grill them on their kind of technical prowess, maybe on their kind of team and communication skills. It's a small step to go a bit further and actually, probe a little bit about kind of what their values are and whether it's a good fit to the values of your company. So I think start small would be my piece of advice. Experiment with it, which again fits very much into that kind of agile way of doing things.
Excellent. And on that note of hiring, I think we've got time for one more. June Kim on Facebook says, as you mentioned, developers don't think values are their responsibilities, besides consideration of values and also ethics is really hard without having some sort of humanistic background. How do you think about the current interest in digital humanism and industry and how that relates to this problem?
I'm not too familiar with what digital humanism means exactly, but I guess if we're talking about hiring, I mean, we not in a software context, but when I was at Monash, we started experimenting with changing our interview process to incorporate values because we wanted to make sure that people we hired were aligned with our values. And all we did was put an extra question in the interview that would ask about values, not in a way as like, what are your values? Because that's not very subtle. But we'd ask things like, if one of our values was balance. So we'd ask things like, how do you manage your time? How do you manage work-life balance and things like that? It's kind of an interesting responses that we got to that question. It was often the most revealing of all the questions that we asked because it kind of caught people off guard. They first of all, they weren't expecting us to ask such a question. And secondly, they often gave us the answer that they thought we wanted to hear. So when we asked about work-life balance, they'd often kind of have a nervous chuckle and then say things like, "Oh, don't worry, I'm a workaholic. I work all the time," which of course wasn't the answer that we wanted to hear. But that's what they thought we wanted to hear, and so it was a really interesting insight into how you can actually fairly easily unpick not just what people's values are, but there was a secondary value there going on, which was about being honest and standing up for what you believe in, which obviously people were willing to do in that interview context. So it's really, really interesting.
Excellent. Yeah, that is really interesting, and the way they've interpreted those questions. I think, and this sort of follows into Tomasz Bednar's question, which is, do you think organizations, all developing software, including game studios, VFX, etc., should be thinking of hiring a CVO? And can these functions be driven by HR change managers? I think that relates back to June's question about sort of the role of humanities in these and into these software.
Look, I'm not so sure it can be driven only by HR change managers, because the key gap here is that we need to get these considerations into the technical work. So you need people that understand the technical work. That could be something like a chief values officer. In my slides earlier, we identified these two roles, values champion and values translator. And I think related to this question, it's really that values translator that's the important one. Because your CVO or your HR might be the champion, but it either needs to be them or somebody else that also understands the technical work, so they can actually relate to the technical work going on the ground, and they can say what a value means in concrete terms, when you're applying, you know, particular off-the-shelf tools or particular design patterns or so forth. So that's the key gap. It's the bridge, you know.
Excellent, excellent. I would love to keep talking about this. We're getting comments still coming in, but I've been told it's time to wrap up. So thank you so much, John, for this fantastic talk. Thank you everyone for attending and asking questions. And we'll see you at the next one, the next SIGGRAPH Frontiers.
Great,
Thanks again,
thank you so much. Thank you.